As the first of the rams flung itself against the fence, Mike pulled out a machete from his rucksack and thrust the blade through the gap in the chain links and straight into the creature's eye. Immediately other rams smashed against the chain link barrier, making it bow a little more with each impact. Mike withdrew the blade, watching the grey face, tinged green in the light of the emergency flare, stare back at him with its one lifeless eye. The pressure from the rams that had already piled up behind the creature kept it in place, not allowing it to fall to the floor. Mike took a step back, and then another. Suddenly there were no visible gaps. The rams had caught up, and now the ones at the front were being thrust hard against the fence. Their contorted grey faces and bodies being squeezed like rotten meat through a mincing machine. As more and more creatures pushed forward, what once looked like a sturdy divide became less and less secure. The metal shifted and creaked under the weight and force of the rams. Mike took several more steps back, each pace whipping the creatures to a greater frenzy. An explosion sounded to the back of him. He knew only too well that it was the distinctive signature of the shotgun. It rang out again. He watched as many of the rams' heads turned in that direction, tantalized by the possibility of finding further prey beyond the lump of fresh meat that stood just beyond the fence. He hoped that Jules had made it out to one of the vans. If she hadn't, it was all over. Over the cacophonous dirge of the growling creatures, Mike heard other sounds, popping sounds, followed by a grinding throb of concrete on concrete. He looked up and down the line of fencing to see 2 of the large stone fence posts had been uprooted and the integrity of the entire divide was beginning to crumble. "Oh, fuck!" His voice was lost in the roar of the creatures. Another loud crack resonated in the early morning air, and as if in slow motion, the fencing began to collapse forward. The first of the creatures collapsed with it, but the ones behind climbed over them as if they were nothing more than rocks or mounds of dirt. Mike's morbid curiosity lasted just milliseconds, as the reality of the situation snapped him back into action. He turned and began to sprint as fast as he could. He remembered when he'd been back in Skelton trying to escape 50 of these things. Now there were hundreds, possibly even thousands. He remembered how they didn't seem to tire, but how he had. He remembered becoming more desperate with each meter he ran and eventually making the decision to trap himself in that house. That, but for one moment of inspiration, could have been his tomb. That day had been a walk in the park compared to this ordeal. He bolted across the enormous car park, for the first few meters not daring to look back, just trying to put as much distance between him and the beasts as possible. It was only after a few seconds that he realized at the other side was another fence, and even from this distance and in such dim light, he could see 3 threatening strands of barbed wire adorning the top of it. Even if he made it across there before the rams, he would probably get caught on the barbed wire and dragged back down to a grisly demise. The noise behind him was constant, but it echoed throughout the otherwise still morning, so Mike couldn't gauge where the creatures were in relation to him. He turned his head, catching a peek, and wished he hadn't. It reminded him of a scene from one of his beloved samurai films, countless charging warriors headed to a bloody battle, except now they were not brave samurai. They had been replaced by bloodthirsty monsters, and they weren't exactly charging towards battle as much as charging towards breakfast. He was running in a straight line. If he changed direction and headed towards the exit, it would mean the distance between him and the creatures to his left would close. If he ran in the direction Jules had taken, he would encounter a similar problem. He could only assume Jules had not made it. There had been no further gunshots. There had been no sound from a revving engine, although that might be difficult to hear over the rumble from behind. He was by himself, and his only chance, if he could call it that, was to get over the fence at the other side and hope that that would give him enough respite to build up a bigger lead. It would all be over one way or another within the next 20 seconds.